What if I told you that one man prevented World War III? Not a president, not a general, but a Soviet colonel who risked everything to save humanity from nuclear annihilation. October 1962. The world stood on the brink of nuclear war. American and Soviet forces were at DEFCON 2, one step away from nuclear conflict. Missiles were armed, bombers were in the air, and submarines loaded with nuclear torpedoes surrounded Cuba. But in the shadows, a secret had already been passed to the West. A secret so valuable that it would change the course of history forever. His name was Oleg Penkovsky, a decorated Soviet military intelligence officer, a devoted communist, a family man, and the most important spy of the Cold War. Welcome to the incredible true story of the man who gave the West the keys to Soviet nuclear secrets, exposed the vulnerabilities of the USSR, and ultimately paid the ultimate price for his courage. This is not a Hollywood fiction. This is not an exaggeration. This is the documented, verified story of how one man's betrayal of his country became humanity's salvation. By the end of this video, you'll understand why intelligence historians call Penkovsky the spy who saved the world, and why his story remains one of the most controversial and debated operations in espionage history. So who was Oleg Penkovsky? What drove a loyal Soviet officer to commit treason? And how did his intelligence prevent a nuclear holocaust? Let's begin at the beginning. Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky was born on April 23, 1919, in the Caucasus region of Russia. His early life was marked by the chaos of the Russian Civil War and the brutal reality of Stalin's Soviet Union. Penkovsky's father had fought for the White Army, the anti-Bolshevik forces during the Civil War. This was a dark stain on the family record that would haunt Oleg throughout his career. In Stalin's USSR, your family history could determine your entire future, and having a white background was a dangerous liability. Despite this, young Oleg was brilliant and ambitious. He attended artillery school and distinguished himself during World War II, fighting against Nazi Germany. He was decorated for bravery, wounded in combat, and rose through the military ranks with impressive speed. After the war, Penkovsky joined the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. This was the elite of the elite. The GRU was even more secretive than the KGB, responsible for military espionage and some of the Soviet Union's most sensitive operations. By the late 1950s, Colonel Penkovsky had access to some of the USSR's deepest secrets. He worked in the State Committee for the Coordination of Scientific Research Work, which gave him contact with Soviet rocket and missile programs. He socialized with generals, scientists, and political elites. From the outside, he had everything: a successful career, a comfortable apartment in Moscow, a wife, and 2 daughters. He was a respected officer in the world's most powerful communist state. But something was deeply wrong. Penkovsky had become disillusioned. He saw the corruption, the lies, the brutality of the Soviet system. He witnessed how the Communist Party elite lived in luxury, while ordinary Soviet citizens struggled. He saw how Stalin's purges had destroyed brilliant minds and loyal servants of the state on mere suspicion. More importantly, Penkovsky began to fear that the Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev was reckless and dangerous. He believed they were willing to risk nuclear war to achieve their political goals, and he had seen enough of war to know what that would mean. In 1960, Penkovsky made a decision that would change history. He decided to contact Western intelligence. This wasn't a sudden impulse. Penkovsky had been thinking about it for years, wrestling with his conscience. He knew the consequences if he was caught: torture, execution, and disgrace for his family. But he believed he had information that could prevent World War III. His first attempts to make contact were almost comically unsuccessful. He tried approaching American tourists in Moscow, but they thought he was a KGB provocation and reported him to the Soviet authorities. Fortunately for Penkovsky, the KGB dismissed these reports as the paranoid imaginations of nervous tourists. He tried to pass a letter to American students. They also refused it. Finally, in August 1960, Penkovsky succeeded. He approached Greville Wynne, a British businessman who frequently traveled to Moscow. Wynne was the perfect intermediary, legitimate, unsuspicious, and willing to help. The connection was made. MI6 and the CIA now had a volunteer asset in the heart of Soviet military intelligence. The operation had begun. Between April 1961 and August 1962, Oleg Penkovsky became the West's most valuable intelligence asset. What he provided wasn't just good intelligence, it was a complete game changer. Let me put this in perspective. Before Penkovsky, Western intelligence was essentially flying blind regarding Soviet military capabilities. The USSR was a closed society. Satellite reconnaissance was in its infancy. Human intelligence inside the Soviet military establishment was almost non-existent. The West didn't know how many missiles the Soviets actually had. They didn't know if Soviet rocket technology worked. They didn't know Soviet military doctrine or war plans. This uncertainty created what's called the missile gap, the fear that the Soviet Union had overwhelming nuclear superiority. This fear drove American policy. It justified massive military spending. It created a climate of paranoia and nuclear brinkmanship. Penkovsky changed everything. He photographed over 5,000 pages of classified documents using a Minox spy camera provided by MI6. These weren't just any documents. They were technical manuals, operational plans, and strategic assessments from the highest levels of Soviet military intelligence. Here's what Penkovsky revealed. First, he exposed the truth about Soviet missile capabilities. The famous missile gap that American politicians warned about? It didn't exist. In fact, the opposite was true. The United States had significant nuclear superiority. The Soviet Union had far fewer operational ICBMs than they claimed, and many of them were unreliable. This was explosive information. It meant that Soviet threats were partly a bluff. It gave American policymakers confidence in negotiations and crisis management. Second, Penkovsky provided detailed technical specifications of Soviet missiles, including the R-12 and R-14 medium-range ballistic missiles. He handed over actual rocket manuals with performance characteristics, fuel requirements, and operational procedures. Why does this matter? Because when American U-2 spy planes photographed mysterious objects in Cuba in October 1962, CIA analysts could immediately identify them as R-12 missile sites. They knew the missile's range, their payload, their launch procedures, all because of Penkovsky's intelligence. Without this information, the Cuban Missile Crisis could have ended very differently. Third, Penkovsky provided insights into Soviet military thinking and strategy. He revealed that Soviet war plans assumed a massive first strike, but that the Soviet leadership was genuinely afraid of American military power. This helped Western leaders understand how to manage crises without triggering a Soviet panic response. Fourth, he identified hundreds of Soviet intelligence officers operating around the world, crippling KGB and GRU operations for years. The meetings with his Western handlers were elaborate affairs. Penkovsky would meet with MI6 officer Greville Wynne in Moscow hotel rooms. He traveled to London and Paris on official Soviet delegations, where he was extensively debriefed by British and American intelligence officers. In London, he spent days being interrogated by intelligence professionals. They tested his information, cross-referenced it, pushed him on details. Everything checked out. The CIA and MI6 gave him the codename Hero, a rare acknowledgement of his value. But running such a high-level source was extremely dangerous. The KGB was always watching. Soviet intelligence officers traveling abroad were routinely monitored. Every meeting risked exposure. Penkovsky knew this. In his communications with his handlers, he repeatedly emphasized the urgency of his mission. He seemed to understand that he was living on borrowed time. In one debriefing session in London, Penkovsky reportedly said, "I am not doing this for money or for ideology. I am doing this because I have seen war, and I know that a nuclear war would be the end of civilization. If my information can prevent that, then my life will have meaning." By mid-1962, Penkovsky had provided intelligence that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Cold War. But the KGB was closing in.
October 16, 1962. President John F. Kennedy was shown photographs that would trigger the most dangerous moment in human history. American U-2 reconnaissance planes had photographed Soviet missile installations in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American mainland. But these weren't just any missiles. They were medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of carrying nuclear warheads. And they could strike most of the eastern United States with virtually no warning. This was the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days when the world stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation. But here's what most people don't know. The intelligence that allowed Kennedy to manage this crisis came directly from Oleg Penkovsky. When CIA analysts examined the U-2 photographs, they saw suspicious installations, but they needed to identify exactly what they were looking at. Were these offensive missiles or defensive SAM sites? Were they operational or still under construction? How soon could they be launched? The analysts pulled out technical manuals and specifications that had been provided by Penkovsky months earlier. They compared the photographs to the rocket diagrams and site layouts he had smuggled out of Moscow. Perfect match. These were R-12 medium-range ballistic missiles, exactly as documented in Penkovsky's intelligence. This identification was crucial for several reasons. First, it allowed Kennedy to know exactly what threat he was facing. Penkovsky's intelligence showed that these missiles had a range of about 1,200 miles and required several hours of preparation before launch. This gave Kennedy options. The missiles weren't instantly ready to fire. Second, Penkovsky had provided information about how long it took to make these missiles operational. This helped Kennedy's advisors calculate how much time they had before the missiles became a fully operational threat. That timeline drove the urgency of the American response. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Penkovsky's earlier intelligence about Soviet missile capabilities gave Kennedy confidence that the United States had nuclear superiority. He knew, thanks to Penkovsky, that the missile gap was a myth. This knowledge was crucial in Kennedy's decision-making during the crisis. During those 13 days, the world held its breath. The United States imposed a naval quarantine around Cuba. Soviet ships approached the blockade line. Nuclear-armed bombers were in the air. Submarines with nuclear torpedoes prowled the Atlantic. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent increasingly erratic messages to Kennedy. In the White House Situation Room, Kennedy and his advisors debated every move, knowing that one miscalculation could trigger World War III. Here's a chilling detail that wasn't revealed until decades later. During the crisis, a Soviet submarine armed with a nuclear torpedo was being depth-charged by American destroyers. The submarine captain, unable to communicate with Moscow and believing that war had already begun, wanted to launch his nuclear torpedo at the American fleet. Soviet protocol required unanimous agreement from the submarine's 3 senior officers to launch. 2 agreed, One officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. That single no prevented a nuclear exchange that could have killed hundreds of millions of people. But throughout the crisis, Penkovsky's intelligence gave Kennedy crucial advantages. He understood Soviet capabilities, Soviet psychology, and Soviet limitations in ways no previous American president had ever possessed. On October 28th, Khrushchev backed down. He agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis was over. Humanity had survived. But the question remains, would Kennedy have been able to manage this crisis so effectively without Penkovsky's intelligence? Many historians believe the answer is no. Without knowing the technical specifications of the missiles, the Americans might have assumed they were immediately ready to launch, triggering a preemptive strike on Cuba. Without knowing the true state of Soviet missile capabilities, Kennedy might have been more fearful and more likely to escalate. Without understanding Soviet military doctrine and thinking, Kennedy might have misread Soviet signals and actions. Oleg Penkovsky literally gave the West the information needed to avoid nuclear war. But there's a dark irony to this story. While Penkovsky's intelligence was helping prevent World War III, he was already in KGB custody. The spy who saved the world couldn't save himself.
The exact moment when the KGB discovered Oleg Penkovsky's betrayal remains somewhat murky, but we know it happened sometime in late summer or early fall of 1962. Several theories exist about how Penkovsky was caught. Some historians believe the KGB had been suspicious of him for months and was conducting a counterintelligence operation, watching him carefully and allowing his activities to continue while they gathered evidence and tried to identify his Western contacts. Others suggest that Penkovsky became careless. He was making dead drops in Moscow, attending meetings and photographing documents at a furious pace. Perhaps he knew time was running out and wanted to pass as much intelligence as possible before his inevitable capture. There's also evidence that the KGB may have been tipped off by poor tradecraft from Western handlers. Moscow was a surveillance state. Every foreigner was watched. Every suspicious contact was noted. What we know for certain is this. On October 22, 1962, right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Oleg Penkovsky was arrested by the KGB. Also arrested was Greville Wine, the British businessman who had served as Penkovsky's primary contact with MI6. Wine was seized in Budapest and brought to Moscow for interrogation and trial. The timing is significant and chilling. While Kennedy and Khrushchev were navigating the most dangerous crisis in human history, the man whose intelligence made that navigation possible was already in KGB custody, facing interrogation and certain death. The KGB interrogation of Penkovsky was brutal. Soviet counterintelligence wanted to know everything: who his contacts were, what he had revealed, how the operation had been run, what tradecraft techniques the West had used. Penkovsky reportedly confessed to everything. Under Soviet law, confession was essential for conviction, and the KGB had methods to ensure compliance. We don't know exactly what happened in those interrogation rooms, but we can imagine. What's remarkable is that Penkovsky never revealed one crucial piece of information: the full extent of what he had told the West. The KGB knew he had been passing information, but they never fully understood the devastating intelligence coup he had achieved. If they had known that Penkovsky had essentially revealed the Soviet Union's entire missile program, including specifications, deployments, and operational capabilities, the shock would have been even greater. The Soviet leadership was furious. Penkovsky's betrayal struck at the heart of Soviet military security. He had exposed their weaknesses at the most critical moment of the Cold War. In May 1963, Penkovsky and Wine were put on public trial in Moscow. It was a show trial, typical of Soviet justice. The outcome was predetermined.
The trial was broadcast on Soviet television. Penkovsky appeared haggard and defeated. He confessed to treason, espionage, and betrayal of the motherland. He read prepared statements denouncing his actions and praising the Soviet state. Whether this was genuine remorse or the result of torture and coercion, we'll never know with certainty. But those who knew Penkovsky believed he never truly regretted what he had done. Greville Wine was sentenced to 8 years in prison. He would eventually be exchanged for Soviet spy Gordon Lonsdale in 1964 and returned to the West, where he wrote a memoir about his experiences. Oleg Penkovsky was sentenced to death. The official Soviet announcement stated that Penkovsky was executed by firing squad, but rumors have persisted for decades that his execution was far more brutal, possibly burned alive in a crematorium furnace as an example to other potential traitors. We'll likely never know the truth of his final moments. What we do know is that on October 16, 1963, Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky, age 44, was executed by the Soviet state. His wife and daughters were left behind, marked forever by his actions. In the Soviet Union, the family of traitors were often punished, ostracized, and relegated to the margins of society. For decades, Penkovsky was officially a traitor, a villain, a warning to others about the consequences of betraying the motherland. But in the West, a different narrative was emerging.
In the years following his execution, Western intelligence agencies began to fully appreciate what Oleg Penkovsky had accomplished. CIA Director John McCone reportedly said that Penkovsky's intelligence was crucial to managing the Cuban Missile Crisis. Other officials were even more emphatic, stating that without Penkovsky's information, the crisis might have ended in nuclear war. Think about that for a moment. One man, acting alone, driven by conscience and courage, provided information that helped prevent the extinction of human civilization. President Kennedy never knew the full story. He died 6 months after Penkovsky's execution. But the intelligence community knew, and they've never forgotten. In 1964, the CIA posthumously awarded Penkovsky a rare honor. He received a memorial in the CIA's intelligence community, though his name remained classified for decades. British intelligence similarly honored him, recognizing that Penkovsky had been one of the most valuable sources in the history of espionage. But Penkovsky's legacy extends beyond his intelligence contributions. His case raised profound questions about loyalty, patriotism, and moral courage. Was Penkovsky a traitor? By the strict definition, yes, he betrayed his country's secrets to foreign powers. Was he a hero? Also yes. He acted to prevent a nuclear war that would have killed millions, possibly billions of people. This is the eternal paradox of espionage. One nation's traitor is another's hero. Penkovsky betrayed the Soviet Union, but he arguably served a higher loyalty to humanity itself. His case also revolutionized how Western intelligence agencies thought about human sources and Cold War espionage. Penkovsky wasn't recruited, he volunteered. He wasn't blackmailed or bribed, he acted from conviction. This walk-in model became increasingly important in Cold War intelligence operations. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russian attitudes toward Penkovsky began to shift, though slowly. Some Russian historians and commentators acknowledged that Penkovsky may have helped prevent nuclear war, even while criticizing his methods. In the West, his story inspired books, documentaries, and films. The 2020 movie The Courier, starring Benedict Cumberbatch as Greville Wynne, brought Penkovsky's story to a new generation. Today, intelligence historians widely agree on several points. First, Penkovsky's intelligence was genuinely critical during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It wasn't the only factor, but it was significant. Second, his case demonstrated the power of human intelligence even in an age of increasing technical collection capabilities. Third, his motivation, preventing nuclear war, was genuine. He wasn't a mercenary or an ideologue. He was a man who saw a terrible danger and chose to act, regardless of the cost to himself. So what should we learn from Oleg Penkovsky's story? Perhaps it's this, that individual moral courage matters even against overwhelming systems of power. That sometimes doing the right thing means betraying the loyalty you're expected to show. That the choice between patriotism and conscience isn't always simple. Penkovsky knew he would likely die for what he did. He did it anyway. In his communications with his Western handlers, he wrote, "I have no fear of death. Death comes to all men. But I will die knowing that I tried to prevent the war that would have destroyed everything." Whether you view him as a hero or a traitor, or both, Oleg Penkovsky's impact on history is undeniable. He was, quite possibly, the spy who saved the world. And that's a legacy worth remembering.
The Cuban Missile Crisis ended over 60 years ago, but its lessons remain relevant. We still live in a world with nuclear weapons. We still face moments of international tension and crisis. Penkovsky's story reminds us that information, courage, and moral clarity can make the difference between survival and catastrophe. If you found this story fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. History is full of incredible true stories that deserve to be told, and I plan to bring you many more. Leave a comment below. Do you think Penkovsky was a hero or a traitor? What would you have done in his situation? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.